I guess I should first start by apologizing for the title. But when Yannis asked me to send in the title, I wasn't yet sure what I was going to talk about, so I tried to choose one which is covering everything I might want to talk about. I hope you will find out what I'm actually talking about from these bits. What I'm trying to do is basically talking about how language can be turned into typesetting, what kind of model could be used if we have a structured document with language information, and what are the problems and what are possible solutions to turn this information in a structured document into typesetting. As you see, I'm using PowerPoint, and in a LaTeX world, and especially as being responsible for the development of LaTeX and the maintenance of the current LaTeX system, it's kind of a fraud to many people. And if this would be a tech audience, I might have get stoned. But fortunately, you will probably bear with me here. I mean, the nice thing about something like PowerPoint is it does your talk for you. I mean, it gives you automatically slides and everything. You just have to fill in a bit. So, skipping the first topic, let's talk about the people working on LaTeX and on the system which is supposed to be called LaTeX 3, perhaps. Here are a couple of names. You have met Johannes this morning. The others are coming from various places in the world. Some people drop in and at some stage drop out. What we do is we currently maintain the official LaTeX distribution, developing and it further, and eventually try to produce a system which is, as I said, might be called LaTeX 3, that will keep the very good points of LaTeX as a system for doing high quality typesetting of technical and other material, but at the same time trying to improve it in various aspects, especially in the aspect of giving access to it in terms of flexible design for a designer. Right now the problem with LaTeX in some sense is you can see what a LaTeX document is from very far. I mean, if you open up a book, normally it shows up, it looks like LaTeX or it doesn't. Only very few people are able to produce documents with a system like LaTeX which are not actually looking like LaTeX. And one of the goals is to actually make this more flexible so that we are able to produce documents of various typographical features. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is basically 6 points. First, I'm talking a little bit of language structure of documents as sort of introduction to what comes then. From that on, I try to show up a possible model for LaTeX, how tags could be represented for dealing with language. Having done this, we will look shortly at actions that are related to language if it comes to typesetting. What kind of things are the problems? What do you want to change if you change a language? Things like this. And having seen those examples, I mean, Johannes came up with quite a lot already this morning, so we can make this short. Then I go and look how to attach such actions when we have a change of language. And there I might be able to answer some of the questions John brought up, and I think somebody else in the audience this morning. Okay, and then as a next point, I come to something which I call special regions. Special regions are things that do not really fit into the whole model, therefore they are special. We will see how later on. Then, of course, every talk should have some conclusions. I will try to give them as well. And if there's time, which might be not the case, we might have some discussion. Okay, so part 1, language structure of documents. Well, what you can say as a first fact, in some sense, is language can be considered a logical element of a structured document. I mean, you attach something, I mean, most of us have an idea that certain things are in a language and you try to attach a tag that represent this information. What exactly that means, language, might be depending on the context. I mean, there are things like change of script. You are in the same language, you would say, but there's nevertheless a change, and it's a question whether you consider this as a separate information or whether you think of representing this as a language change in an abstract sense. Okay, but another point to make is that language can be independent of what you normally think of the logical structure of a document. As an example, when I come back from a conference like this and I talk to my son, I often start off talking English to him. And in the middle of the sentence, I realize that this is not actually the appropriate way to talk to a 12-year-old in Germany. So I switch languages. I mean, he's used to that by now. But if you try to model that kind of speech, then you will find out that I might cross languages in the middle of logical structures, like an instruction to my son, do this, do that, do something else, and the third one is suddenly going on in German in the middle of the sentence. So if you try to do things like this, you find out it's not a single logical structure that could be sort of being nested or something, but there are two structures intermixed. There are other examples like that, but what you can say from that is, in some sense, documents are not trees. Even if the SGML people would like us to believe that they are trees, they aren't. However, I don't want to go too deep into that because trees is more or less the only thing mankind understands and can handle in the computer. So it's fortunate enough that we can view documents in most cases reasonably as trees. And if they are not really trees, we have some ways to sort of fix that. So for the rest of the talk, I'm actually sort of implying we have a tree structure if we talk about logical documents. So what are the tag structures that we can envision if we think about documents? Well, first of all, one way to look at things is you can think of language being a flat structure. At any point in the document, you have a current language. And that's it. I mean, at some other point, you might have a different language, but it's just a flat structure over your whole document, and you don't think anything other than, well, this is German, oh, now it's English, now it's French, whatever. Well, this is one way to look at it, and in the audience, in the previous talk, I think there was the question what to do about these insertions in base language, and yes, there's another way. You can think of it as a nested structure. You can think of it that a certain area of your document is in a certain language, but that this area is embedded into a bigger area, which is in another language. And if you think of it from a typographical point of view, that might be very important. Because one being sort of the basic language of the whole document, where the other is just an insertion of, we had the example of a name or maybe of a quotation or whatever. So the nested structure is something you might think of being perhaps more representative. But yes and no, I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. What you probably need is the notion of a base language, which means that sort of for one portion of your text, this is the major language. In many documents, you have only one base language, and the rest are sort of nested insertions of various shorter bits. But you might very well have documents where you have several base languages. For example, in the European community, the documents are 9 languages side by side, which with equal weight. And then, of course, you would think of each column or whatever the representation is as being its own base language. But then inside those base languages, you might have shorter or longer insertions in different languages, and those you would consider of these language fragments. Okay, so this is one way to look at it, but there's another way which is more visual, and it's also very important if it comes to typesetting. We have something which I would call the block level. You have language changes which consist of full paragraphs. For example, you might have several paragraphs being a quotation in a language other than the base language of your document. And this is often handled differently from what I call paragraph level, where the language change appears within the paragraph for just a small bit. We will see examples of why this might be important. So we have a different structure here as well, a different view. So if I wrap this up, I come to basically two hierarchies. If you, for the moment, just ignore this upper thing called document level, then this one here is something, the first hierarchy, which is given by the nesting. You have base language, or you have several base language in a flat structure, and then within those base languages you have a nesting of languages up to a certain level. And the second hierarchy I was talking about is this more visual one, where you have paragraph blocks, which might in fact also be nested in theory. And within such a paragraph block, you might have something which I call fragment levels, where only small strings are changed. So these are the two ways I want to think about a little bit later on. Okay, having talked about that, we might be able to think about a possible model for tags inside LaTeX, or inside another system. In fact, it's not that LaTeX specific. What I want to have here is, on the top level, something which I called a document language tag, which is normally implicit, which is supposed to cover the whole document, even if you have several base languages. This is a kind of catch-all. We will see why this is necessary or important later on. Within that, we have those base languages, which are flat, so there's no nesting. And within the base language, we have language block tags, which are full paragraphs. They can be nested inside, in fact. And we might have language fragment tags, which are within a paragraph. And clearly, they can appear directly within the base language, but they can also appear within one of those block languages. And just to give a short look at what the possible interfaces for this in LaTeX 2E, or LaTeX 2 epsilon, in fact, the plus says LaTeX 2 epsilon is in some sense fixed, so we don't intend to actually produce new stuff on it as part of the internals of LaTeX 2E, but we think of this kind of model for LaTeX 3, and we might put out an implementation for 2E as a kind of add-on for experimental things. So that's the plus. Yes, so those things are basically saying the same as before. The kind of interfaces we think of is a base language change command, so it might be declarative in that case. And then an environment to have block structures supported, and a command for the short insertions within a paragraph, where you want to switch to a different language for a short bit. In LaTeX 3, in fact, we might end up using language attributes on appropriate tags. That would fit nicely with the HTML world, and especially with the the web side, because there we have a notion of language tags as well as attributes, and it is unfortunately not appropriate for the current interface LaTeX has, but we might have a more general interface in LaTeX 3 so that attributes could be supported on a more general level. So that covers basically tags. Now we have tags. What do we do with that? How do we attach actions to them, and what might the actions be? I will give a couple of examples. I will go fast through them because we don't have too much time. I mean, the talk was originally for 35 minutes, and now, yes, it's a little bit less. Sorry? No, we will see. I'm going through this. This is basically, I'm giving examples in 4 areas. You might wonder what the difference between formatting and output is. You will see it probably in the end. It's a little bit technical. You can consider the last 2 as the same, more or less. Well, these are examples which are actions related to language, but not necessarily actions that should be related to language. I'm partly just offering thoughts that certain people had and actually also implemented, but I do not agree in all cases that they are really language related. First of all, on the input side, if you have 8-bit text, for example, and you have certain keyboards, then what you end up with is you have an input encoding coming through the kind of computer you use. Now, if you want to be general and allowing to typeset your stuff on various different computers or in different places in the world, then you need to have a uniform internal form of everything so that it is unique. And therefore you need some ways of transforming whatever localized version of operating system you have into a standard form inside. And there is something like an input encoding necessary. Whether this is really language related or whether it's partly language related, you can discuss that. Same with short references. Short references are nothing else in some sense as helping you with deficiencies of inputting. It's an inputting method in some sense, and Johannes talked about them. He called them shorthands, but this is basically what I mean. They are related to language in the sense that people in certain regions use certain conventions. So you might want to think about that in this way. More important in some sense is transformation, which is changing or enhancing your internal text while you are processing it. First of all, you have generated text, which is text which is not part of your structured document source, but which is generated while the internal processing goes on. There are 2 versions. One I call content related. Think of a date command, like LaTeX has something called today. It produces the date as a textual string with things like January in it. Now, clearly, if you have a command like this, and you're typesetting in French, you want a French month name there. So this is something that needs to be changed. It might appear anywhere in the document put in by the user. Then there's other generated text which is coming from the structure itself. So if you have a bibliography, it might automatically put in a heading and saying references. It might say bibliography. It might say Literaturverzeichnis in German. It might say something else. So again, there is something which has to be translated if you change languages. It's certainly not a unique translation because you have a lot of possible answers to what should appear there. So it's not that you can say for a language what kind of word should there, but it's clear that things like this need at least the possibility to be changed. Also hyphenation rules and, for example, transformations like turning everything into uppercase, which is a convention in some publications that, for example, running heads are uppercased. And then, depending on the language, you have different tables. Okay, that gives me a bit of quarter of an hour, I think, right? Yeah, formatting is something we talked about already in various points. Direction is something depending very much on language. There are subtle things, like what I call micro-rendering. For example, within glyphs, if you think of a umlaut, this is differently typeset in German than in other countries. We usually have a lower position of the diacritics than it is, for example, typeset in UK or France or somewhere else. So there is something which is language-dependent difference. You could say a different font would be used, or a different kind of flavor in some sense. Then we have ligatures. We had this example already. Some languages do not use certain ligatures. I gave this example. The FFL is not used in Portuguese, it's not used in Turkish, I think. And there are other examples like this. And beside these micro-renderings, there are many more, but the slide is kind of ending somewhere. We have, of course, things like formatting of logical elements. The example I give is quotes. They change in the UK and US. You have quotes like this. In Germany, you have this, and in France, you might have those, or this way around. I can't remember. All those things change with language, and they are related to logical elements of your document. And then, of course, you have big typographical changes like page layout, float placement, positioning of certain things, which might have conventions in your language. But again, you might consider that being partly a question of style. But in fact, there are languages which have very tight rules to certain aspects of these things. Okay, so what is output? Output is the kind of technical part of the formatting which actually has to do with the typesetting system you all actually use. In case of tech, and not so much in case of Omega, you have to think about what kind of font you have to use if you typeset in a certain language, because of these restrictions. And this font might have a different encoding. So you might need to actually offer a different kind of default encoding when you change to a different language. Okay, so we have seen all these kind of examples. Now we can try attaching them to the tags I talked about before. First of all, as a conclusion, in some sense, this is more a technical point. Actions can be modeled by setting a group of parameters. That's just a claim. And I think it's not so far from the truth. If you look at all these examples I've given, then you will see that certain examples do not make sense at certain levels if you think of this hierarchy model. I mean, hyphenation, you might clearly want to change all the time you switch to a different language. On the other hand, this example with the quotes, changing of the quotes character, you might not change, sort of going down in several languages, always changing quote characters. A designer might say, well, I will always want only the quotes used in the base language of the document, or only the quotes used up to the first level of nesting. So this is something that might not go down all the way. And as a sort of conclusion from that, there is not really a fixed place for action in the hierarchy I talked about. Perhaps with the exception of hyphenation, you might say you want to change hyphenation all the time so the place is far down. But for everything else, it usually depends on the design of the document you want to make, how much changes you want to actually do when you change from one language to another, or when you change from one language embedded into another. So this is kind of open. We have to find a way to actually support that. So here's one way to trying to attach action to this nesting structure. Well, first of all, we can say nesting structure gives a hierarchy automatically. So we have top level and then we have nested levels. What we do in the model is we define that a certain action is defined to be executed down to a certain level in the nesting. And what that means is that whenever we come to a language change, we change that action unless we are further down in our nesting. So in that case, we do not do any more changes. Now, different actions, as I said, might be executed down to different levels. And what is important is that the stopping level depends on the action, but not on the language. So we either do hyphenation always, or quotes always at the base language, but we're not doing quotes for French on the base language and for German down to the third level.
You have a problem then when you change scripts.
No, you don't have a problem there. I don't think so.
When you change scripts, you won't use Latin alphabet quotes with Arabic.
Yes?
You won't. No, you won't.
But that's the question of what you design as a designer. To what level you want to change those things.
No, but
No,
you would
no.
say French is a base language.
Yeah.
You would say French quotes down 3 levels. Now that's okay for German quotes, for English quotes, but you have an Arabic quote, and for that Arabic quote you want the Arabic quotes.
So it doesn't depend on the action. It depends on the language and all of the script.
So in other words, what you're saying is we do need to have that flexibility as well. Right? Nice. Yeah. It's always nice to see more complex things as you want to do. So for the moment, we leave it at that. But I take your point. This is basically a discussion model, and I'm very happy to get those ideas. Okay, fine. Anyway, this was the first hierarchy I talked about. We have this visual hierarchy about the language tags being differentiated depending on the paragraph level they appear. And there we have, again, a kind of hierarchy because the blocks are sort of bigger than the fragments. Fragments can live inside blocks, but not the other way around. In other respects, it's the same as before, except that we might have to fix that one up down here. So, if we want to combine those two, what do we have to offer in a model? Basically, what we have to offer is we have to offer on which of the two hierarchies my action should depend. So I can decide either I want to make this depending on paragraph level structure, or I can decide to make a certain action depending on the normal nesting structure of things. And then we have to decide to what level down the action is carried out in the hierarchy. And at a third point, we might have to say something as special effects for certain languages. Okay, looking back to the old picture, how do we combine those two hierarchies into a possible usable thing? And the idea here is basically we do it this way. As you see, I've lost some of the complexity on the right-hand side. I have only one block level, fragment level, and nested fragment level. We think that it is enough for practical purposes. It might be that this needs a little bit enhancement. We will see when we actually come to playing that and showing it to designers in a practical fashion, but I think that's about the level we actually need. What is important about this diagram is that at any point in the document, I can always determine where I am on this diagram. So I am in second nesting level and inside a block, or I'm in the third nesting level and also inside a block or in a fragment. So this can be determined by the system, so it's always known where we are in that hierarchy. Why do the things go together at the bottom? Well, simply because that means all. When we put an action to the last point, it means it will always be changed. Okay, this was the diagram. Now, as I said, I do not want to have the actions depend, the positioning of the actions depending on the language. We were making our lives easier, and we thought of having a simple table for describing actions and related to languages. This might need some additions now again, we will see. Anyway, right now in the model we have a table which stores the effects of action for each language. Now, this is indexed by parameter group, which models an action, and by a language label. Each entry contains an expression or expressions that are giving values that are appropriate for that parameter group. And special expressions might be, first of all, leave unchanged. That means don't care about that the language changed, just use what you currently use. Whether this is sensible, I'm not sure, so that's a question mark. And the other one is use default. This is basically meaning for that language we don't know, we don't have any special thing, so you use a default, which might be, for example, the default used by the document language or by the current base language. That might be up to the designer what this kind of default is. Okay, so we have now a table containing actions for each language. Now the other thing, which is what we call the PAM, which is now assigning these parameter groups or mapping these parameter groups to our diagram. And what we do here is we map each each action to one place in that hierarchy diagram. And you said that's not enough, and we will see what we do about the exceptional cases. What does this mean? This means that if we map this to a certain point, then every change of language, for every change of language, this action is carried out as long as we are in the corresponding hierarchy, higher up and including. So we go down in the hierarchy, we execute actions whenever we change language up to the point where we come to that special point, and then this action is no longer carried out further. So, that was the general model, and you can now say, except for this small thing we haven't talked about, it is all fine and nice. It isn't. And why not? Because, as I said, documents are not trees. And this is not only true for the logical part of documents, it's also very much not true for the visual part of documents, even more. And this is where this notion of special regions comes in. So I give fast a few examples. Elements that move in an unformatted way, if you think of those, you have table of contents entries which are collected at some point in your document and are carried out to some other point. You have index entries which are usually attached to certain bits in your document, and they are collected somewhere else. There are other examples, running heads which are generated, footnotes, endnotes, answers to exercise, you name it. All they have in common is that they take logical information from your document, collect it in some form, maybe transform it slightly, and then process it at some other point. And you will clearly see that it's not really appropriate to make a difference between an index entry, which is for some reason in a nested structure of languages, compared to an index entry somewhere else, which is on base language level. Because at the point where you actually typeset the stuff, you have no notion about this was the third level of hierarchy and this was the first level of hierarchy or whatever. So there we have to think about what to do with those things. Now we have not only unformatted things, oh sorry, there's a second point. Data type of this stuff is you have a language label and you have text, but there's the stuff you move needs to carry the language around. That's important, and this is the problem Johannes talked about this morning. As a second example, we have this. Those things are formatted already in the LaTeX system. This is partly technical, but it's also conceptually usually the case. I mean, you can view figures as being outside your document, except for something like the caption number. The thing is, in some sense, a block to you. So it's formatted externally, the main part of the figure. Same, footnotes and marginals are also things that are moved around, but are already formatted when they move. And then we have a third part, which is things that break the paragraph hierarchy I talked about. These are examples. If you have a table inside a paragraph, then inside that table you suddenly might get new paragraphs in the table cell. Or if you have complex mathematics, then you might have inside the mathematics text in the formula. And that form text might actually be consisting of paragraphs. In fact, we had a request for somebody sending in a bug report to LaTeX where he was nesting formulas, and inside these numbers, and inside the formula hid another formula which also had a number, and that didn't work. It was not nestable. This might sound silly, but this was a serious request, and I mean mathematicians are known to come up with very strange formatting requirements. Anyway, it should be clear that there are things which just don't fit this paragraph idea. So that paragraph is something, after you have a fragment, you are no longer coming back to a full paragraph. So all this brings us to what I call special regions, because we have regions that contain text that was moved from anywhere else. So whatever hierarchy you had at that point where it comes from, it doesn't really matter because you have your own sort of visual context. Then we have the stuff that was formatted and moves around, and we have these kind of things that break the hierarchy we talked about. So these are all things that do not really fit into the model so far. So what can we do about this in language context? Well, there are two main possibilities. We can offer the designer control via what I call a local PAM, which is this parameter assignment mapping, giving a method to set a starting language and a specification for a local assignment map for each of those special regions. Well, this is one way, and it is probably too powerful to be of any use. I mean, nothing against powerful systems, but what you need is something practical, and sometimes it's better to go with a little bit less. Anyway, we are thinking of at least attempting to implement a kind of smaller concept, which is not that powerful. We call it init-inner pair. It has three kind of variables: a method for setting up a starting language for your special region, a specification of what we call init level, and a specification of what we call inner level. What does this mean? It means we have if we come to a special region, we have an initialization phase where the starting language is resolved. This might be a fixed resolvement, this might be a formula of some kind from the designer. And then we execute all the actions in our action processing method as if that region has started with a tag of level init, on level init level, using that starting language we have determined. So what's the effect? The fact is that we get actions that are, we get parameters set to values which are suitable for that starting language. We also allow, with this kind of concept, that the region is considered to be sort of its own visual context. So this is that part, but we haven't talked about this inner level. What is this good for? Well, once we now typesetting that special region, we handle tags, language tags, appearing within the special region, as if those tags would appear on, as if the region would have started on a tag of level inner level. In other words, as an effect of that, it gives us a certain kind of finer control, because we can allow that only a subset of actions in that region gets changed. So we start with a starting level to set all kind of actions, but then within the region we might say we don't want to change so much in some sense. So this gives a kind of balance that you have some additional flexibility. Okay, I'm nearly made it, I think. Conclusions. We need interfaces if we want to implement such a model. And I want to stress that this is not actually a model for LaTeX. It's a model you could think of implementing in any typesetting system. You could think of having it in Word just as a flat structure of languages. If it considers languages at all, it is flat. It's either German or French or whatever. You can mix them, but it has no notion of typographical things. You can put it into FrameMaker any way you like. Anyway, going back to LaTeX, because that's my main hobby, what interfaces do we need? First of all, we might need specifying the tag hierarchy diagram. That's this abbreviation, in case you don't remember. Well, I said if not already fixed, why not? Because I think, in fact, we can consider one of those structures being enough. We don't need to actually allow flexibility on sort of the number of levels you want to consider or something like this. It's probably enough to say we have 4 hierarchy and nesting structures and this block levels or whatever. So I think this doesn't need any flexibility here, but we might decide differently after a while. Then, of course, we need a way to allow specifying the parameter assignment mapping, and of course changing it so that you have parameter assignments for your house style or for certain document classes or for certain languages as a default, but you might want to change those around. Of course, we need to be able to add entries to the language action table. For example, if you have a new application which is language sensitive, that means it needs to do certain things differently or wants to be able to do certain things differently if the language changes, then it can sort of add to that language table, making its own interfaces known to the general system. And of course, we need to be able to change entries in that language table as well. I didn't say this. Well, and for the special region, we need to be able to specify starting language, inner level, init level, and modifying this kind of as well. Finally, we need inside LaTeX better support for attaching language tag or language information to text that's moved around. And as a kernel thing, which just doesn't really have to do with the model in itself, but since I want to implement that kind of model as a prototype during the summer, and therefore sort of getting on with the LaTeX 3 work direction languages, we certainly want to look at the kernel to see what kind of additional support we need for bidirectional typesetting. Because as it was said this morning, LaTeX was built with the view of left to right typesetting. If you have the proper underlying structure like ETEC, where you can run LaTeX on, you can typeset from right to left. And maybe one day it was Omega from top to bottom and bottom to top and whatsoever. But the LaTeX package in itself has certain assumptions built in that it is actually left to right. If you look at, for example, enumeration or itemized structures, bullets, lists, then there are certain built-in concepts that are actually only properly work if it's left to right. If it's right to left, you can still typeset, but the layout isn't as changeable as you want. So there needs to be additional kernel support for this kind of stuff. Okay, and since we talked this morning about Babel, my second conclusion is speaking a little bit about the relation to Babel in terms of this model. What's different? Well, what is different in some sense is that we have more flexible customizations for a designer. Not in the sense for a user, but for people designing layout. We have language-related changes that depend on the tag level and the relation to paragraphs, and we do have conceptually support for any kind of special regions. What we not, or what I don't intend to support, is declarative forms of language changes, other than perhaps the base language change. This is partly technical, partly because I'm strongly a believer in tree documents, even if I say that they are not trees. It's much better to delimit your areas by begin and something rather than just by individual declarations and maintain internally your stack of nesting in the system. So this is partly a technical thing. Babel does, historically, I would say, support much more declarative forms and has a lot of problems with the support of that. And I think it is not sensible for a fully LaTeX package, or whatever you call that, to take too much notice of the need for other flavors of tech in some sense. I mean, you can't win them all. It doesn't work. I mean, if you try to support everything, and you find that you support nothing properly in some sense. And I think this is one of the crucial bits where you better go step back. You will see. Finally, what is open is whether a model like this could be supported in other flavors of tech, like plain tech. Well, if you look at these things like the PEM and the LET and this hierarchy diagram, then the LET, the language action table, is a declarative thing. You define for every language and every action, you define what is supposed to happen. And being fully declarative in that model, you certainly can write something in plain tech that makes use of that declaration. So in this respect, a fully declarative set of information, what kind of changes one might do when switching to a certain language, might actually be nicely and cleanly implemented in other flavors. What I'm not trying to do is to actually support it myself. I mean, that's not something I think we should do or we can do in the future. Okay, that brings me back to the last bit, discussion, questions. I'm happy to try answering any question except for one. Just like Don Knuth is not saying when volume 4 of this Art of Computer series comes out, I'm not going to answer the question when LaTeX 3 comes out. Anything else, I will try. Thank you. Well, John?
With respect to multi-directional typesetting in Omega, one thing I didn't make clear is that it already supports, there's no problem whatsoever with bulleted lists or whatever. If you're doing vertical typesetting, the bullets start from the top. If you're doing right,
We'll see that in the afternoon anyway.
There is a lot of problems whatsoever, John. It's not on your level. It's on the higher level of LaTeX. There are built-in assumptions about certain things. Of course, you can just turn your stuff, but it's not as simple if you think about indentation and stuff like this. It needs additional support, believe me. I've talked to people, say, from Israel, and about certain problems in the LaTeX kernel if they try to support it properly. But, sorry?
They don't use omega. They
They
use
don't
tech.
use omega.
I don't think that has anything to do with omega because it's built in the LaTeX kernel, not in your.
No,
the
but
lower
the
level.
point
It's
is-
a question of
But then you turn it and you turn it around. then
if you just turn it around, it doesn't matter. But there are other issues. But anyway, I hope it will be easy. I guess. Martin.
Have you had a look at how CSS is a simple style sheet language that is supposed to go with HTML? I mean, it has a lot of things that it's definitely not on the level of tech and LaTeX, but it has some interesting features and to associate certain kind of style-related stuff or other properties to certain levels and combinations of nesting things in a hierarchy.
The question was, have I looked at it
Yeah.
in detail? No, I haven't
If
looked
no,
at it in detail.
Maybe you have a look there.
It's
maybe
certainly,
there's an idea.
it's certainly, but I have looked in detail at a lot of other systems, including Tissot in its original form and also in its later versions. But no, I haven't looked at that yet. Any other questions? No, wonderful. And it's
No, that was it.
You have one?
I do not understand the relation between omega and create. So if you have mentioned about the direction in the kernel, so that I'm acting, and I think I've seen omega that is right.
No. Right now, LaTeX, when I talk about LaTeX, I mean LaTeX built on tech. Or perhaps on eTech, which allow bidirectional typesetting, but that's basically what it allows. But in principle, as omega is an extension of tech, you can run LaTeX on top of omega rather than running LaTeX on top of tech. However, if you run it seriously on omega, then you can do some things much nicer than you can if you run it on tech. That it will also be clear. So once that sort of goes together, it might mean that certain things can be done nicer. When I spoke about direction support inside LaTeX, I assumed that the underlying machine has already a possibility to change direction. So it would be eTag or it would be omega. The support that I was talking about was more on the level of the macros for not assuming certain relationships of parameters which are sort of clearly biased towards left to right typesetting, but also giving hooks to allow mixing right to left typesetting on the higher level of LaTeX layout. So I need a machine that actually does the actual typesetting left to right or even top to bottom when it comes to that.
So you will be able to run LaTeX on omega and
Well, I think you will be able to run it on omega. I mean, right now, I think the only change of LaTeX that is put in, and that is not actually even necessary if you run it straight, you can run it straight off without any change, is in one place. If you take the current LaTeX and put it onto omega. However, things like, you name it, short references, certain aspects of typesetting could be done differently in a system that has additional power, that's sure. The point is, right now we have two upcoming extensions of tech in the system. One is omega, which is geared toward a certain model, and then there is another one which is eTech. And there's a sort of brain thingy which is called NTS, but this hasn't got off the ground, and I don't think it will. But I mean, at some point when those versions might come to a certain extent together, or they might actually sort of one actually becoming the replacement or the sort of kind of standardly used extended replacement of tag. And certainly once that is sort of becoming more and more the standard, then clearly as the LaTeX project team, we will certainly support that as the major basis. Right now, the major basis for us is, and we can't divide ourselves into too many pieces, we are right now only 6 people, is the platform, or the basis tag, because that's the million users we have and which rely on our support. But that doesn't mean you can't run it with Omega or you can run it with ETAG. You can very well run it. It's only that we cannot sort of support everything in parallel. So these things like doing everything nicer will at least partially have to wait, because we have to see that Omega becomes stable. It doesn't really help us trying a lot of experimental work to keep up with the kernel of LaTeX, because that has too large user base. But on the other hand, there's no problem to actually use it.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think we can go for lunch, and we'll start again at 1:45, 1 hour and 10 minutes. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
The Electrotechnical Laboratory was founded in 1891 at Ginza, a central area of Tokyo, as a testing station which belonged to the Bureau of Electrical Affairs in the Ministry of Communications. This is the origin of the present laboratory. The Electrotechnical Laboratory, or ETL for short, has continuously exhibited clear foresight and played a pioneering role in research fields underlying advanced industrial science and technology, such as electronics, standards and measurements, energy, and information processing. ETL has now reached its 100th year. And in preparation for the next century, ETL is steadily advancing research in the fields of electronics, bioelectronics, standards and measurements, energy, and information. Let's have a look at some of the research topics.